I'm very pleased tonight to be able to welcome Nicklas Lundblad, Director of Public Policy at Google DeepMind, to both our online audience and to our in-person audience. And thank you very much for showing up on this rainy Tuesday evening. We're going to be exploring tonight the trajectory of current AI capabilities over the next 3 to 5 years and what this means for progress. Specifically, the title of the event, which is AI for Science, is at the heart of progress. So here's how the format's going to work. We're going to have a conversation, Nicklas and I, and after that conversation, we're going to open it up for discussions, and you can throw questions at me if you wish, but probably for our guest, Nicklas. For our online audience, you'll be able to submit your questions to us via the Q&A feature. I guess we're using Zoom, and please include your name and affiliation. And if you do ask a question, it always helps if you wish to identify yourself or your name, your affiliation, just so we have some context. For those of you here in the theater, we'll let you know, I will let you know once we open the floor for questions. You can raise your hand, and the stewards will bring you a microphone so that everyone can hear you, and also the people in the online audience can hear you. I'll try my best to ensure that we have a range of questions from both the online audience and our audience here in the theater. And I guess there will be some way for me to know what the online audience questions are. Okay. Right, so without further ado, let's get started. Nicklas, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role at Google DeepMind and what it means to be Director of Public Policy?
Sure, happy to. So essentially public policy and working in public policy, especially at a company that deals with emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, or you can imagine the same for synthetic biology, quantum, etc., is largely about figuring out what happens when this technology diffuses broadly into society, and what are the kinds of questions that we have to be able to answer, what are the kinds of new challenges that we'll encounter. And the public policy team sort of sits at the intersection between society and technology. And that's something that means that we are part of negotiating that new technologies use and introduction into society. So that's the sort of the broad picture. That means anything from engaging in fora like this. So I want to really thank you for the invitation. It's very kind. I'm pleased to be here. To working with international institutions, to talking to politicians, to working with civil society, all of those different things, to engage in this larger conversation about technology and the way that society is going to look in the future. So that's the job, essentially.
Google DeepMind is a very impressive place, and we are all in awe of some of the technological developments that have come from Google DeepMind. So I know it's really grown, and we've had the pleasure of meeting some colleagues, and people, visitors from Google DeepMind before at DSI. And what strikes me is always very interesting what sort of background people come from. And I know that your background has not been a traditional tech trajectory background, if there is such a thing. So tell us a little bit about how you came to that position and what your background is.
So my academic background is that I have a law degree, and then I was really bored studying law, so I also studied philosophy. And so I ended up studying philosophy and artificial intelligence, and this was back in 1997. Because philosophy of mind and artificial intelligence have a close relationship, and I wrote about Martin Minsky, Daniel Dennett, others who sort of have theories about how we think about mind and artificial intelligence. And having done both of those things, I then went to the US and spent a year working for the Swedish Office of Science and Technology, charting trends, technologies, etc. And then when I came back, I decided to do a PhD. So I did a PhD in informatics. And so, yeah, that's roughly the only place that would have me was Google at that point, because I had sort of completely messed up my career. And I started at Google in 2007. I worked at Google in various roles. I spent 4 years in Mountain View. I came back. I led our work in EMEA, because the Americans really do believe that EMEA is a region: Europe, Middle East, Russia, Africa, and Turkey, which is I don't know why, which is amazing. And then I spent 2 years at Stripe, a small financial tech company building their global tech policy work. And then had a chance to work with Google DeepMind and Demis, and it was sort of a childhood dream come true because artificial intelligence had been one of my first intellectual loves, I suppose. So that's my checkered background.
That's fascinating. So, of the educational experiences you've had, which have proven more enduring? What you learned in informatics or what you learned in philosophy?
It's philosophy for sure. I mean, I think philosophy is the single most useful subject that I've studied overall. And partly that's due to the teacher time. I had the good luck to have a teacher called Nicklas Lundblad who was an ardent Wittgensteinian, like really ardent Wittgensteinian. And we spent so much time talking about the meanings of concepts, the role of language, all these different things. And that's something that I have carried with me ever since. I think there's an enormous value in being able to clarify concepts, thinking through what they mean, thinking through how they move in language. And so philosophy for me was really, really important. I also did a year and a half of just the theory of science, which made me into a hopeless skeptic, I suppose.
Very, very, very interesting. So, let's talk about the title of the event, or what you sent over as the title for our discussion tonight, which is AI for Science is at the heart of progress. Here at LSE, unlike our friends at Imperial, we're very much about social science.
Right.
We're grappling at the moment with how AI is transforming the way that we would understand knowledge and produce knowledge in social sciences and economics, for example. Next door there's a talk about this very subject with the governor of the Bank of England. And I know that they've been criticized, for example, for their forecasting model, and there's various aspects where they're trying to constantly, like everyone else in our field, up the AI game. So is AI at the heart of social science progress, or how can it be?
I think it can be at the heart of all kinds of scientific progress, and certainly social science as well. Not because I think social science should necessarily be turned into a mathematical science, but because artificial intelligence can be used in so many different ways. If you have a domain and you have data for that domain, and you can make it legible for the technology, and you can start asking really interesting questions. You can put in all the speeches of politicians for a certain period of time into a large language model. You can start asking questions about patterns. You can see what the trajectory looks like for voter behavior across urban and non-urban areas over time. You can do a lot of different things. And I really believe that we are building here in artificial intelligence much more of a scientific instrument than usually is realized. The mental image a lot of us have when we think about artificial intelligence is like a chatbot. You write things in, things come out, and you get an Irish limerick, and you're very happy, and then you sort of get something else, and sort of this back and forth. And that's a useful set of things to do with artificial intelligence. But the more we look at it, and we have a science team who's just amazing, the more we look at it, the more we start to see that maybe a better mental model, metaphor for what AI is the scientific instrument, a sort of universal scientific instrument that can find deep patterns in complexity. Because complexity is at the heart of the social sciences. I think to a large degree, trying to find patterns in complexity is what you're trying to do in social sciences, and that's something that artificial intelligence is really good at. You know, the microscope allows you to see small things, the telescope allows you to see things that are far away. I think artificial intelligence can allow you to see patterns in complexity in ways that allow you to explore new hypotheses and new ideas.
For me, that's really, I think, one of the novelties of AI in the knowledge production in social sciences. For the first time, and I guess it's true for sciences as well, but for the first time, it can help us formulate questions rather than answering the questions that we come up as scholars advancing a field or trying to come up with something new. And it's what every PhD student has to do, every master's student a little bit, but definitely a PhD student going to come up with a question that no one's really examined before, and then you've got to justify, well, why not? That's the hard part. But if AI finds those niches for you, I guess it puts PhD supervisors slightly out of a job.
Is that a good or bad? No, I mean, it doesn't necessarily, right? Because I do think that finding the right question is something that we as human beings are uncannily good at. The art of questioning, because it's sort of truly an art to ask the right questions, is really, really hard. And I think it's hard also to translate into artificial intelligence. Human beings have this innate ability to ask questions that is completely bizarre when you look at it. Because if you look at a small child, maybe each of, say, 6 months or something like that, that child will have a question intonation at the end of some of the sounds they make before they have a theory of mind. What this means is that children actually ask questions before they think there are other people around. This is so fundamental to who we are. It's something that, you know, if we believe that there's like an Aristotelian demarcation criterion for what it means to be human, asking questions might very well be it. And then I think asking the right questions or asking questions together with this technology becomes an extraordinarily powerful method to develop the sciences.
AI and the foundation models that contain the training weights from so much data and so many parameters are trained on what was before. How would AI help us to identify the questions of what should be asked that wasn't coming before? In other words, how do we improve society in a progressive way that doesn't reinforce the biases of the past?
This is an old question, and a really interesting one. This is what Turing refers to in his paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, as Ada Lovelace's objection. Because Lady Lovelace had this theory. She was, for those of you who don't know her, you should look her up. She's referred sometimes to as the first programmer. She worked with Charles Babbage. And she wrote a lot about computers and their limitations. And one of her core tenets of her beliefs was that a machine or a computer could never do something completely novel. It would never be able to create something that was completely new. So to your question then, the machine probably can't do that alone. It probably needs to do that together with the human being. Now, it does raise a somewhat complicated question that we don't have a good answer to, and that is, how on earth can human beings do that if you can't find a way to algorithmically progress from what we already know? What is it we tap into that allows us to do things that are completely new? And this is where you get into really murky territory in the philosophy of mind. And you find the likes of Roger Penrose who would sort of argue that there are deep quantum effects in the brain of different kinds that actually allow us to do things that are if not algorithmic, they're sort of pseudo-algorithmic or even random to some degree. So I think that it remains to be seen if novel, surprising questions can be asked in a way that's deeply generative by the machine. But it's also, for now, quite enough to be able to discern patterns, show them to human beings who will go like, that's weird, we should do something about that and see what that leads us to.
AI for helping scientific progress implies, I mean, that's part of the, I know that DeepMind is heavily involved in some of the molecular discoveries and biological modeling. I think there's a new model announced 2 weeks ago.
AlphaFold 3,
AlphaFold 3. So could you give us some examples of how AI has been at the heart of some scientific discoveries or that might be pushing the boundaries of these discoveries?
Well, currently the AlphaFold system is used by more than 1.8 million biological researchers around the world that are working with this day to day and discovering new things all the time. So they're moving the entire horizon of biological sciences with this particular tool. And I think it's really important that we're able to do that. And it also speaks a little bit to what it is that artificial intelligence does with science. The fascinating thing about AlphaFold that I find sort of quite profound is that this problem of folding a protein is something that we've been working on for quite some time to get right. We know what proteins are, we have a good sense of the amino acids that go into them, but the way they three-dimensionally fold has been really hard for us to predict in different ways. Used to be that you would hand this to a PhD student who had to go away and do it and then come back 4 years later and then hand you one protein. And you know, they would say, good student, give them a PhD and they go away. And so I think that was sort of how we used to do this. Now we did it with AI and we did 200 million proteins. And we've now done proteins and interactions with other kinds of technologies too. And if you think about that, and you do the back of the envelope calculation, you realize that's 200 million times 4 years of a regular PhD. That's 800 million years of time. That was suddenly created through that particular piece of technology. And that's the other aspect of artificial intelligence, that it can accelerate scientific discovery in different ways. And that's important. And it's important for an interesting reason. One of the sort of dark secrets of science and economics is that it seems as if scientific productivity has been decreasing over these last couple of decades. There's a really good, yes,
really?
And this is really interesting because publications have been exploding, but if you look at things like, so there's a paper by a guy called, I think Nicklas Lundblad, I want to say, called Good Ideas Are Getting Harder to Find, in which he sort of went through and looked at the doubling, the Moore's law doubling, and saw how much resources was needed in order to keep this doubling up. And he found it was several X for each doubling of the capacity of the processors, several X more than the previous time. And it was becoming more and more expensive to keep up Moore's law, which led to a lot of other people also researching this, and the OECD putting out quite a robust report looking across a number of different fields, finding that scientific productivity is declining. And there are many of different, I mean, this is not necessarily hard to understand because we have plucked the low-hanging fruit. We found the easy-to-find things, and now we're trying to sort out what to find next, and the universe of combinatorial things we can research is exploding just because of the publications that you mentioned, right? The number of publications out there are enormous. Nobody has time to read them all. So are we really making progress, or are we just publishing? And so, I mean,
I see a lot of academic colleagues asking themselves.
So this is partly why we need artificial intelligence. And the fascinating thing about this, it's not a new insight either. This is the core reason a lot of the early pioneers thought we would need artificial intelligence. So there's this one author that I strongly recommend you read, who's called Nicklas Lundblad. He's a Polish science fiction author, brilliant, and also slightly bonkers. But he wrote this book back in 1963 called the Summa Technologiae. So that's a piece of megalomania right there, right? Because the Summa Theologiae was Thomas Aquinas's large piece of theological writing that underpinned almost all of Catholicism. So he then thought he would write a sort of follow-up on that, which was the Summa Technologiae. And in this book, he describes artificial intelligence in chapter 5. But he calls it, he has a much better name for it. If I was branding it today, I would totally go with Nicklas Lundblad because he calls it intellectronics, which is so much better. And the reason he says that we need intellectronics is that we're running out of scientists. The pace of progress is such that we're not going to have enough scientists to continue scientific progress. And all of our civilization is this really weird Faustian deal where we buy progress at the price of complexity and then use science to unpluck that complexity to get more progress over time. And if we can't continue that flywheel, we're going to be in terrible, terrible trouble, Nicklas Lundblad says. So we need more scientists. And what do we need then, he writes, in the chapter about electronics, are artificial scientists. So we just sort of throw a lot of artificial scientists in there so we can keep the pace up. Or, because he was writing in the Soviet area, we'll just forcibly recruit everyone in a society to become a scientist, which seems like a less workable solution. So it's like not a new insight that we need some kind of tool or technology to keep scientific progress at pace and working. And there's a lot of interesting things about this. He fundamentally also believes that artificial scientists won't be enough, for example. He thinks that at some point we have to automate the production of knowledge to the point where we decouple it from understanding. So we will have a lot of knowledge that we can use, but we won't understand because it was produced within a black box. So we will know that these things work really, really well. They produce better medicines than before. They produce better energy. They clean up the climate. Well, we'll have no idea why. And this idea of a science where knowledge and understanding are fundamentally decoupled, where he says we will harvest knowledge, much like we harvest any other kind of naturally grown biological resource. This is just amazing to think through. And if you look at what's happening today, the complexity of the technology we're building, and the sometimes black box nature of it, he was not that far off.
No, I think that what you described would be familiar to anyone using technological tools today to assist or augment their work.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the gulf or the difference or the potential for a little less difference between academics and industry, academia, industry. So the classical vision, maybe when we got started in academia, it was that people went to universities as the repositories of expertise and knowledge, and if you wanted to learn something, you would go to the finest minds, the finest professors, you would aspire to the finest universities, and you would learn those things there that would then serve you in your career. And an academic career was it's still, it can be a brutal, subject to a brutal hazing process called tenure. You have to achieve some of those publication outlets, and if you get through it, you can become a professor, and if you don't, well, we used to say, for those who can't teach, do. They might go into industry. But now we look at our industry colleagues with envy, because it's places like Google DeepMind or Google or any of the big tech companies that have more data, have more computing power, and frankly have more brain power than universities today can hope to achieve, and more financial resources to make sure that those resources remain concentrated in private sector. Now that might be a fairly bleak picture. It's not all that bleak, but we do look with envy at the resources that companies like Google DeepMind have. So have I mischaracterized that situation? And if it is not, if there is truth in it, then what can we do to create partnerships to make sure that both sides thrive?
Well, I think it's a great characterization, and I think the problem is not so much that there are resources in private sector as much as there is a dearth of them in the public sector. And I think if you want to do this in the right way, you have to figure out how do you actually turn science into much more of a public project. And this is where, for example, proposals like the National AI Research Resource as being discussed in the US is really important. There's a significant amount of work also on this in the UK. There's the high-speed computing initiative in the European Union, and I do think that we need more of that. I do also think that we need massive investments in building data infrastructures for our society to make them legible for this technology. And I think there is a need for society to realize, and that's why we say at the heart of progress, because we need to recenter science from being something that's just done in universities into something that's at the heart of how we think about societal progress. And while I agree with your sort of picture of if you sort of look at this for the last 100 or 200 years, it's not necessarily true if you go back further than that. Knowledge was being produced in a much more distributed way in society. Darwin didn't hang out much in university. So there's another need here, which is to increase participation in science. If you look at measures or metrics in science policy that are rarely used but could be really interesting to think through, one of them is the number of people in the society who participate in a scientific project. And we have an opportunity now, we have a window to sort of rekindle our interest in society and science as a society, because we've gone through a pandemic, we're sort of in a really difficult situation after a financial crisis. We have sort of some sense of acuity or urgency that I think we should work from. And it is almost like a Vannevar Bush moment, right? When Vannevar Bush, after the Second World War, wrote this fantastic policy piece called Science, the Endless Frontier, where he sort of set out all of the scientific institutions, the way they should work, the way they should be funded, the stuff they should do, in a single policy piece that he then submitted. And that largely was passed at that time. But that requires that we make a couple of hard choices as a society. We should invest more in this. And then I think we can also invest more in legislation that in different ways involves private sector. I think public-private partnerships are absolutely needed. But I think at the heart of your question lies another question, which is, why have we, from society's side, from the public side, so diminished our interest, investment, and prioritization of science? Why have we almost allowed it to become a special interest? And that's weird, right? Because science is our organized collaborative curiosity. It's what drives us forward and allows us to solve really hard problems. That shouldn't be a special interest.
I agree, and I also believe that social sciences are one of the most fundamental things we have to understand as societies to improve.
Yeah.
And when we get that, we're seeing, I guess we could call it the culture wars, or we can see political interest interfering with priorities that they perceive quite wrongly, in my view, as being having captured the social sciences. And I think it's extremely exaggerated. My own background in political science, I have colleagues in the United States that struggle to get funding for their projects from legislatures that would cut all funding for political science, for example, all public funding, which is a ghastly sort of idea, in my view. I'll stop there.
I agree. I mean, society is the sort of the complex system that society provides us with is such a fertile ground for research and such an important thing to understand if we want, because progress can't just be made through proteins. I like proteins, but I think proteins are sort of, the reason we like proteins is that we are water of proteins, and we do things, and we are interesting, and that's where the sort of real research focus at some point should lie.
So let's talk a little bit about responsible AI and the issue of responsibility, because this issue of making sure that products and the incredibly powerful tools and the vast amounts of data that companies, for example, have access to. I know that as a researcher, for me doing the sort of research that you mentioned before, where we're putting all the speeches of politicians, for example, into an AI model and generating insights using that. Not for public speeches, but I would need ethical approval, and I had to get ethical approval to, for example, analyze tweets, which are public. But you got companies who are harvesting and generating that user-generated content. They don't need ethical approval. It's just their proprietary data, and we don't know what they're doing. So there's a difference, following on this theme about academics versus private industry, about responsibility. And it seems that there are multiple standards that haven't all been sorted out yet. How can we ensure that private companies do behave responsibly?
Well, I think there's a set of different things that are happening on the responsible AI area, and it's a good question. The first thing to remind people is that, of course, companies operate under the rule of law, right? So copyright, data protection, all of those different things apply to companies, and companies are not allowed to do things that are outside of the law. If they do, they get prosecuted for it, they get investigated, they pay huge fines, and that's what happens and should happen, because I don't think that companies should have sort of get out of jail free card there. Then I agree with you, there's a lot of proprietary data. There's a lot of data that can be used because it was sort of produced in such a way that it is now the proprietary data of the companies. That is possibly a problem if you want to do public research on it. And I know there are a lot of conversations between companies and researchers on how to make this data more accessible and to think through how we can give more access to the data. And I think that probably needs to happen. When it comes to responsible AI, a huge part of it is also the internal codes of conduct that companies are setting out. And there's an international discussion now about how those codes of conduct can be externalized and how can hold people, companies are accountable for them. So, for example, you see in the executive order now in the US, there's a set of different rules where every single agency is now providing the roadmap for what companies have to live up to in order to be responsible and produce responsible AI. So there's that piece of it that I think is really important. And then I think there's also something else around responsible AI, which is understanding how this technology works, figuring out how to eliminate bias from it, make sure that it is reliable and robust. And this is an ongoing scientific project to figure out how we can test this new complex technology in ways that allows us to perhaps not guarantee, but at least make robust assessments of the technology as it's put in use. I think there's still a lot to do here. I don't think any of these questions are solved. I think currently, as we're sitting here today, there is the Seoul, Korea summit on AI safety and the future of AI in different situations, where there was just a new set of commitments published by the companies on what they will do, how they will scale responsibly, the new technology they have, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in the midst of a compressed legislative, regulatory, normative period that is very, very fast. I mean, having worked in this sector for quite some time, I usually tell people that in 18 months, the last 18 months, we've got roughly 10 years of internet policy. Because the speed of policy production is really, really high at this point. Which is probably not wrong, because the technology is progressing quite fast too.
it's staggeringly complex, and this issue of accountability is a really important one. I'm a little bit less optimistic about the deterrent effect of fines. I mean, Facebook paid record fines that no company's ever paid on the scale that Facebook had to pay, and it was like a parking ticket. There's no revenue, so it's incredibly small, and it's also difficult to hold accountable practices that can't be understood by policymakers or the public. But I don't want to get too far down that because we want to start with the questions from the audience shortly, but I want to leave with one more question before our discussion part concludes. Looking ahead, and you can tell us all the secrets that you wish, or looking ahead, I mean, if we look back over just a year ago, what we're talking about today is things that are almost difficult to imagine. That's just 12 months. If we look ahead for the next 12 months, or say the next 5 years, or even the next 10 years, what sort of breakthroughs can you imagine happening?
Yeah, I think the next 10 years no one knows. But I can tell you what I think will happen in the next 18 to 24 months. And the kinds of trends we already see, the kinds of things we already see that I think are interesting. One of them is that we're in the midst of a transition from models that are almost prompted models to agents. And this will have a huge impact on how we think about artificial intelligence, because a model is something that we interact with and then passively responds to our prompts in different ways. An agent can act. It can be mission prompted. You can give it a mission to go sort your vacation. It can be mandate prompted. You can tell it to answer your email. I'm so wishing for that. And so there's a whole set of things that an agent can do. And while it sounds useful and it will be fantastic, it also has some profound questions attached to it. Because one of the things that now happens is that we're introducing artificial agency into our social systems in a way that we're not necessarily entirely understanding how it will affect those social systems. Agency is interesting. Agency is sort of one of the understudied relations to intelligence. We often talk about artificial intelligence. But artificial agency is equally interesting, because agency is something that almost all of our institutions are premised on in different ways. Take a super simple example. Take the queue. A queue works because you have to pay attention and agency in order to stand in the queue. If there was an abundance of agency and attention, then at that point the queue wouldn't work, because no one would know how to actually order the queue anymore. The queue is reduced to a lottery when there's an abundance of agency. And when you have a number of artificial agents, and you can instantiate any number of them to do things for you, the amount of agency in our institutions then increases massively in a way that's hard to predict how it will actually impact them. Take a market. Does a market work if you have 10x, 100x, 100,000x as many participants in it? Does it work if it runs in computational time with an infinite amount of attention and agency that is completely artificial? How does that work? Those are things that we really haven't sort of thought through yet, and we need to work much more to think through in order to get this right. There's a huge piece of work from the ethicists at Google DeepMind called On the Ethics of Intelligent Assistants that sort of starts to unpick some of these issues. I think it's really interesting. The second thing that is happening is that we're moving from text as the natural medium for artificial intelligence into images, video, sound, and a lot of other things as well. This is usually referred to as multimodality, but that sort of sells it short. It's because what you're doing is that you're providing the artificial intelligence systems with a sensory apparatus. And I find that deeply fascinating, because if you interact in the world, a sensory apparatus is absolutely essential. So it provides you with all the inputs you need in order to understand the world better. And evolution has fine-tuned us as human beings really, really well. You know, we have eyes, we have ears, we have all those senses, the 5 different senses. And our eyes are amazing. We might even be able to detect singular photons in a dark room with our eyes. So we're really finely tuned. The senses are such a huge part of our evolutionary survival capacity that it's easy to forget how important they are. Now, an artificial intelligence could essentially have any sense that you can produce a sensor for. And a sensor is a physical measurement. So any kind of physical measurement you can make, you can build a sense for. So now imagine this artificial agency, where there's a lot of different artificial agents, with an infinity of senses. Every physical measurement you can imagine can be instantiated in a sensory apparatus. That's the point at which things start to get really interesting. And but the last piece I'd say that I think is interesting is that we're currently still stuck in this idea where we think about models as unitary things. As there's a model, it does things, we can evaluate the model. But it's increasingly clear that what we're building are ecosystems, because these models interact with each other in different ways. And as they start to interact with each other in different ways, predicting how an individual model will react is actually less useful than trying to predict the ecosystem. I mean, you will be really familiar with this, because it's like one of the core fundamental theorems of social sciences, that a person is like a problem and two people are like, that's hopeless. Yeah. Right, that's sort of the premise of social science. But so this is also going to be deeply interesting. So you have this sort of artificial intelligence and attention, you have an infinity of senses, you have an ecosystem that's sort of growing around this technology. That's why I think it's so important that we have dialogues like this, because this is something that will require a lot of thought. It will require a lot of insight and thinking and a lot of collective, collaborative decisions that have to be made in the space of politics, not necessarily the space in commerce. And I think we're sort of progressing towards those discussions, but we need to do more.
Thank you. That is really thought-provoking. I would love to continue this conversation. I'll have my AI contact your AI. Yes. Let's take some audience questions. I'm sure we have lots of them. I want to reward John here in the front row, who worked hard in our education panel.
Thank you.
First question.
Yeah. I'm John, an assistant professor in education here at DSI. I'm puzzled by something you said that seems to me an apparent paradox, in that you said that if there was an Aristotelian demarcation of what a human is, it's their ability to ask questions, right? But what's to say about those intellectronics, artificial scientists that are there to find the right questions to ask or to figure out the world by themselves? Or if I were to train an AI agent and let it into the world with the sole purpose of asking questions, are they humans? Are they, where do you draw that line?
What I meant with the demarcation criterion is that I think as human beings we're really, really good at asking questions. And I am not sure that artificial intelligences are as good at asking questions yet. And so the ability to ask questions that is almost uncannily precise and find the right thing is something that might still distinguish the human being. I think it's really difficult. You're touching on another question, which is quite deep, which is this question of, at what point does an AI become a human being? And I have this view, that's not shared by everyone or anyone at DeepMind, which is that at its heart, artificial intelligence is a softly narcissistic project. We're trying to build something that is like us. We want this to be like us, and because if we build something that's like us, then we will feel in some way that we transcended the limitations of our mere being and we became as gods, or something like that. And there's something about that that's just deeply wrong, because we, as human beings, are so different from the artificial intelligences we're building that we need to understand these as separate phenomena. One of the great traps when it comes to understanding artificial intelligence is to think that we're building something that is like us. Now, we have evolved. We're part of an evolved set of embedded ecosystems. We are also embodied. We have bodies. We're finite. We die, which is sort of nature's way of updating us. And so we have all these different things that are deeply different from what artificial intelligences have. And we are also rather limited in our senses to our environment. If you're sort of building an underwater submarine, you don't want to put a human artificial intelligence in it because it will go like, help, help, I'm drowning, I'm underwater. You want to put a dolphin intelligence in it. So that's going to be much smarter, right? So to some degree, I think that this sort of idea, it will be like us, or at what point do we actually transcend the limit or the level where we call these humans, is the wrong question. We should, in some ways, we would have been much better off if we had referred to this as extrabiological intelligence and studied it as a unique kind of artifact that exhibits some of the behaviors we usually ascribe to intelligence, but also a lot of the other behaviors. In some sense, it's stranger than we think. And I think that's sort of the thing I think is often forgotten. And something that if we sort of remember that, it allows us to escape from the narcissistic trap of thinking it's like us. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. I'm not saying up there in the back.
Thanks very much. Very interesting conversation. I got trouble that thinking about the knowledge that you were talking earlier. So knowledge that we don't understand, but still we know that it's useful. I'm not a linguist, but I assume that the etymology of knowledge comes from human thing. And the scientific inquiry, our collective scientific inquiry is quite sort of deeply rooted in understanding, methodology, like that sort of progress. So if you're going to talk about machine-generated phenomenon, then is it okay to continue talking about it as knowledge? I think same thing applies probably other things like machine understanding, machine learning, machine being intelligent. So is there a problem with basically with the language? Do we need to recalibrate how we are talking about these things?
I think there is. Our language, it's a problem of sorts, but languages is a devious thing. It always builds on this fundamental notion of analogy. All linguistic sort of patterns are analogous in some way. So analogy is the fundamental form, I believe, as does Douglas Hofstadter and several other cognitive scientists of human being. How is this like this? And so we always go for the analogy, which is why I think we would sort of say it's a kind of knowledge. It's useful, we can use it for something, but we don't understand it. So I would agree with indexing on something else, calling it something else. But I also think that language really doesn't allow us to do that because it forces us back into the analogies, which is dangerous. Because then when we start treating it as knowledge, we might forget that this is knowledge A, not knowledge B, and then we should treat them differently because one actually comes with fundamental understanding and an ability to explain how we arrive at the insights that constitute the knowledge, whereas the other does not. And I think that making these fine distinctions, these conceptual clarifications, is essential as we're moving into the domain of mental concepts. And you're right, learning, intelligence, all of those things are things that we usually say about human beings or biological entities of different kinds. But now we're applying them ex analogia across a number of different artifacts that are fundamentally different. And it sort of also goes back to the answer to the previous question. We have to be careful here so that the metaphors don't gel and force us into making category mistakes because we're not sort of finely attuned to these distinctions that still need to be made. And I have a lot of sympathy with that, not least because I think that's sort of the key to also figuring out some of the niceties in policy and sort of how we negotiate this as a society. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think it's going to be really, really hard to do. Yeah.
Let's see, so many questions. How about you?
Hello, my name is Anshu and I studied public policy at LSE. I have a very easy question. So public policy tends to advocate for social good, and corporations often work opposite because they're obviously driven by revenues and profits. So in your role and in your team's role, how do you balance both? How do you balance we are Google as a big giant and as a very important part of our day-to-day lives, like anybody who's not using Google in their life, even once, is living under a rock. So how do you balance both, that Google is contributing to social good, but also balancing the profit side? And the second question is, how do you use that approach into influencing government's thinking and contributing to that? In my past life, I worked with in UK civil service and also had a previous degree in bioinformatics. So the protein example, I've spent a lot of time simulating proteins and doing drug designing, so that really resonated with me as well. So yeah, those are the questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I think the first thing to recognize is that sure, corporations have profit motives, and those profit motives are primary to a lot of what the corporation does. That's why we sort of invented corporations back in the day. They didn't just sort of pop up from somewhere and start to make profit. There were institutions that we put in place because we believed we could reward a certain kind of risk-taking within that particular corporate form. Now, that said, I'm not entirely sure that they're only risk-taking, because this notion of profit maximization is still somewhat unclear as to what the time horizon is. And different companies try to make profit over different time horizons. And I think one of the things you can push for if you're in public policy in private sector is to say, look, I'm all for making profit, but let's make sure we don't make a quarterly profit, but that we try to make a profit that is perhaps over the next decade or so. So that's the leeway you have, acting within the rationality of the corporate structure, but still figuring out how to push the boundaries. That's not always easy, because the financial market, a lot of the investments, a lot of our pension money pushes for a shorter horizon. So figuring out how we deal with time is actually at the heart of the question of the profit motive and the social good. And how we deal with time in society is really something we're not that good at. We tend to become more and more short-termist. And I think that's deeply problematic. I think, for example, it would be brilliant to devise a corporate form that was taxed only once every 10 years. Because I think that corporation would have very different incentives than one that's taxed every year. And you could try it out, and you can see what happens with that company, what happens with this company, if you have those different horizons. And to some degree, I also think that the really large corporations are not easily reducible to the profit motives because they have such an amount of chaos. And one of the things that I would like to recognize is that if you're in a company and people say, the company wants this or the company wants that, it's rarely true. A company of more than 100,000 people have a lot of different wills. And there's a lot of different initiatives and a lot of different things happening in that company. And to some degree, it's a mix of all these different wills, and those wills are often well-intentioned. The useful fiction that a corporate entity makes decisions actually devolves into real people at the end of the day. And there are a lot of really good people who work throughout these organizations and want to do a lot of really good things. And I do think that there is an argument, if you're working in private sector, for trying to push the time horizons, trying to make sure that the good voices actually get more of a hearing, and then working through that, whilst recognizing that corporations are mechanisms for rewarding risk-taking in terms of economic gains. And the reason we put them together is that as a society we believe that corporations are helpful to produce that kind of risk-taking and to sort of move us forward. And if we don't believe that, then it's completely fine to not work in the private sector and work against the notion of corporations and say that they become deeply extractive over time, they have become problematic, and they no longer actually serve those fundamental purposes that they were once set up to serve. I think that's a logically coherent and consistent viewpoint, if you want to have that viewpoint. I don't share it, but I can see why you would argue that way, and I can see why you would end up there. So there's a lot of really interesting things when you start to sort of scratch the surface. The challenge is when you try to reduce every corporation into a profit motive over the next quarter, because I think that's not actually a model that's very helpful in trying to predict the weird stuff that companies do.
And how do you support the government with that thinking, which often rewards short-time gains because they have limited time?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question because it actually differs from technology to technology. If you look at the ethos in sort of the artificial intelligence community, it's deeply different than the ethos was in the internet community. So rewind to 1996, the internet was still young, it was becoming sort of more of a thing, regulation was being discussed, and you have the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace from John Perry Barlow. It's one of the most bombastic, fantastic texts that you can read. It starts something like, "You weary giants of flesh and steel, leave us new citizens of cyberspace alone. We don't need your laws, we don't need your rules." So sort of the ethos was, the internet is this new space, and we won't make the mistake of invading the nation state, because the nation state only maximizes our power, right? The internet is a separate world. And all of that then went on and on until we had the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring sort of turned that into a very different kind of conversation. But that was the ethos of the internet. The early sort of Google policy team had a single mission: keep the internet open and free. That was it. Regulation was seen as the antithesis to freedom, in some sense. Artificial intelligence is not like that. You have a series of companies, you have a series of actors, you have a large contingent of engineers who work on this, that believe that this technology can be the single most beneficial we'll ever invent, but it needs to be heavily regulated, it needs to be framed in public institutions, it needs to be democratically governed and made accessible to as many people as possible, so we don't make the mistake of just providing technology to the already haves, but we also need to figure out how to provide it to the have-nots. And I think that if you then take that ethos and you ask how we interact with governments, I think the reality is that we have been asking governments for how we can have this legislative discussion and working with them from the get-go in artificial intelligence in a way that I find personally, having been part of both worlds, massively different than how we thought about this in the internet days. Does that make sense?
So many interesting issues there. This takes me back to a year ago when we had the symposium. We were next door and in a larger room with having this sort of conversation with Sir Tim Berners-Lee.
Right.
We were talking about the three internets and some of the models that you just described. So it's a nice link back to that event. We've got so many more questions. Mark, you had your arm up there. If you want to ask me.
I did. The moment may have passed, but you mentioned, and I may have misunderstood, sort of knowledge A versus knowledge B, confusing the two being dangerous. In the context, I think of what we might gain from the things that we could learn from artificial intelligences sort of working together. And I think I might challenge you slightly on that and say that there's knowledge about the way the world is that doesn't depend on human assent at all. And then there's knowledge about the way that our different worlds work. It very much depends on that. And what's interesting to me is that artificial intelligences could tell us a lot about one kind of knowledge, and they could actually participate with people in the second kind of knowledge, and we may not want that. But it is, the more that we fashion them to be like us, the more of that may happen. And that was an intriguing point that you made when you said that these systems will be communities and ecosystems and talk to themselves. So I think there's a question in there, which is, do you want that world that you talked about, and how can we have it and have it work well for us?
It is an ongoing discussion within the AI community on how you design agency ecosystems and whether you design them to be siloed so that you don't have a lot of interaction between the different agents, for example, or if you design them to be transparent so you see everything that they're doing, and a lot of different things like that. And you can imagine any number of architectures, and I think that's going to be a value wash. What kinds of values do you want to embed in your technology? I don't think there's one particular architecture that dominates all others. Although I think that open and transparent architectures often tend to be more successful in many cases. On the question of if we want them to participate in, if I understood you correctly, in the production of knowledge that is deeply human, I'm not sure. I think there are inherent risks in that, and I think that there's an argument for having some institutions be human only, for example. And there's a series of really interesting questions here that are not entirely easy to solve. One of them is, for example, the judicial system. As sort of a recovering lawyer, I tend to think that one of the things we need to understand is, would it be better for us to have automated artificial judges than to have real human judges? And you can approach this in many different ways, but you can say that any which way you do statistics on the judicial system, you will find that judges have very varying sentencing guidelines, for example, for what is essentially the same crime across different regions. And you can solve this in several different ways. The French way of solving this was to prohibit any statistics on the judicial system. That's obviously the best way. But it sort of responds to your question, because the reason they did that was the dignity of human decision making and law. So do we actually really want to run statistics on the way our legal system works? Or is that going to detract from its dignity and its institutional function once we see those enormous discrepancies? And then on the other side of that, you find people like Audrey Lobel, who wrote this fascinating paper called AI for Good, in which she argues ardently that there should be a right to request to be judged by an AI. If you believe that everyone is against me, there is a bias against the group I belong to, the kind of deed I did, but you still want to have a fair trial, you should have the right as a citizen to request artificial judgment, automated judgment, because that's the only way to guarantee that you actually have the freedoms that we afford to citizens in our society. So that touches on the question you're asking, I think. How do we think about things like, and they will come to the fore when we discuss things like the judicial system, because that's so inherently connected with this idea of equity. There is a uniqueness to each human case that needs to be respected and needs to be taken into account when we make decisions as human beings about other human beings. And equity disappears in statistical analysis. The sort of Aristotelian notion of equity, this idea that there's a uniqueness to the case that could require that you do something just sort of in that particular sui generis case. So So I think there is a lot of questions there we don't know the answer to. But the place to start looking, I think, if you look at where the things are happening right now, might be the traditional system, because there is a lot of interesting questions attached to that. Make sense?
What an idea, too. I hear all the time people talking about the potential bias that could come from AI, and you've just introduced the concept of a judicial VAR. Like,
Yes.
I want the machine's judgment to sort that out.
Yes.
Okay, look, we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Let's take you over here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And then I'm a student at the University of Bristol. I study digital health, and then my research focus in human-computer interaction in diagnosing lung cancer. So by background, I'm a radiologist, and the medical community is obsessed with the evidence generation and questioning the evidence-generating methods. So in your talk, you were mentioning that the AI is an accelerator for the science, and also I could say that AI is already in the loop of scientific evidence generation and publication process. So do you think we need more complex contextual framework to ensure the accuracy and efficacy of natural language processing?
Yes, we do. We need both expertise, contextual knowledge, and rooting and grounding in different kinds of human experience and the subject. So I think there is a lot of work ongoing to make sure that happens. And that's also why I think that there's no blanket way to answer the question, how should you use AI? It actually will vary very much from domain to domain. And each domain has to then figure out how to make the domain legible first, so we can start addressing it with technology, and then contextualize the use of it through experience and human interaction. And I do think that's going to be tremendously important. And I think it's not actually only going to be human-AI interaction. I think it's going to be human-AI interaction. That you're going to build models that sort of second-check other models together with human beings. Because what you want to avoid is that you have just a human-in-the-loop model. Human-in-the-loop models are really popular. A lot of people think it's great to have a human-in-the-loop. Problem with that is that humans tend to go like, well, like the machine says so, I guess. And then they do so even more when they're uncertain. So when they're really uncertain, and that's when the AI typically is at its worst, the machine is maximally tends maximally to go with the machine. So they tend to sort of really defer to the machine at the worst possible moment, which is interesting. There's a lot of studies of this from the Santa Fe Institute that are really fascinating. So what you want to build is this more complex contextualization ecosystem where you might have super and supra systems looking at each other together with human agency in different ways, so you can contextualize across several dimensions and across time. And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge that goes deep into institutional design as well. Does that make sense?
We have so many questions that people would like to ask, and I know that it's tough to cut it off, but you know what, we're going to take one more question. And I think you over here had your hand up for some time, so I'm going to go to this side.
Thank you. So Christian Folson here. I'm a senior data scientist at SoundCloud. Working among other things. SoundCloud, yes.
My son loves your service, yes.
Yeah, that's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of data. Hundreds of million. And I would challenge the notion that we can't glimpse new insights from models. That was mentioned earlier, but also support the notion that we can use this as an amplifier in science. So you mentioned Santa Fe Institute, of course, like complexity, agent-based modeling. Those are tools that I don't see the LSE currently teaching, but I would have liked to learn when I was here because they turn out to be really useful. If you look at the work of Lloyd Farmer and others at Oxford. Pearling counterfactuals also deal with the judicial issue, where you have a counterfactual on an individual level. So it's not just statistics, but it's like this specific person, given how the world works, would this specific person do something different? So this is also something quite interesting. But in terms of like specs to see the future, like what are your tools at DeepMind for looking into the future? Like I mentioned a couple of like complexity science tools, but also I'm curious, like what are your like super telescopes in the sense to like look at
The two of them, Demis and Shane, we call them. And so, so it comes to people, right? Because there's a lot of people who have worked on this field since inception. We have the pleasure and privilege to work with people who were pioneers in this field, and I think they still see things differently, and they still see new things. So the real answer is the people. We also then work with a number of different things, like what you mentioned, like typical complexity scenario planning systems, different kinds of agent-based systems, etc., to figure things out. There's a lot of work being done on computational social science that is agents-based, figuring out how you can test different policies in a virtual society. So if the dream of virtual biology is to build a virtual cell, because at that point you would no longer be limited by biological time in understanding how cells interact with different agencies, and you could be able to accelerate it by 100,000x and then be able to really speed things up. The dream of the sort of computational social science is the virtual society that you could also then free from biological time.
They're getting pretty close, it seems.
Yeah, there's a guy called Joel who's working a lot on this, and is really good at figuring out how we can, because it's also a question of how you reduce complexity to useful simplicity in modeling, right? Modeling is really, really hard. But there's a lot of work going on in that domain as well. And I do think that sort of a plug for complexity is really important. The work that the Santa Fe Institute is doing, this notion of complex systems and how we think about them, is very much at the heart of what we hope that AI will be able to help us with. There's a series of really interesting, Billy Krakauer is one of the leaders over there, had a really interesting talk some time ago where he spoke about artificial intelligence and complexity science as complementary in understanding the world in different ways. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So complexity is next one.
We do teach agent-based modeling. We do use network.
Fighting words! Fighting words!
Things have come a long way. In fact, in 4 weeks' time, the LSE summer school starts. There's still time to sign up if you want. We do teach courses in network analysis and machine learning across a variety of programs. In fact, I'm currently the program director for data science in the summer school, and I'm very proud of the offerings that we have, because I think we should be teaching those in a social science context for exactly the reasons that we've just spoken about. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our brief discussion. We could do this for much longer, I realize, but we designed this day not to tax anyone's attention span, and I think that we've sparked questions that we can take away and continue to think about and debate. And also, we have the opportunity now to take what is really a relatively small group upstairs to the 8th floor, where we will have a short reception for our speaker. We'd like to, or my guest, I should say, Nicklas, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been a privilege to have this discussion with you.
Thank you.
I want to